Kia ora and welcome to the Global Journalism Seminars. This is The Briefing. In 2020, New Zealand media giant Stuff issued a public apology for 160 years of monocultural news coverage that had simultaneously sidelined and created a distorted and oppressive image of the nation's indigenous Maori people. The apology came off the back of Our Truth, Tama Tupono, a months-long investigation by 20 reporters into Stuff's news coverage dating back to colonization in the mid-1800s. We polled our journalist fellows to ask if they thought their newsroom operated with a Eurocentric lens. 75% said yes, 12.5% each said no, or that they were unsure. We also asked if they thought their audience would benefit from a newsroom that operates with a multicultural lens. 75% said yes, 25% were not sure. The Tama Tupono project was the first output of Putiaki, a working group conceived by today's guest Carmen Parahi to help Stuff achieve better representation. Carmen joins us today to explain the Putiaki philosophy and approach to adopting a multicultural lens in newsrooms. That's The Briefing. Let's begin.
Hello and welcome again to everyone that's joined in virtually, to everyone in Oxford. Here we are back again with another global journalism seminar. Delighted to introduce and welcome Carmen Parahi. As you heard, she's been doing a lot of work around monoculturalism. In essence, is it important to have more diverse voices in the newsroom, and why? Sort of native intelligence would tell us the answer is yes, but Carmen has spent a lot more work breaking that down and explaining why it's important and how you can do it. Carmen was, of course, formerly with New Zealand's large media outlet Stuff. She is now an independent journalist, but continues her work in that regard. Not least does she deserve our respect and doff of the hat, because it is currently midnight for Carmen in New Zealand. And you are, for lack of a better term, you're a bigger man than I am, Carmen, which is amazing to see you sort of give us your time, insight, and to do that all at midnight. So I'm going to hand the baton to you, but I will sort of perhaps use an opening placeholder for those joining, which is if you could walk us through the idea of monoculturalism before you make your presentation. And that's a little bit of a switch around today, which is that Carmen's going to present some of her findings. And then of course, as always, we'll open up the house for questions, both from our journalist fellows and from the audience. Carmen, monoculturalism.
Monoculturalism, love it or hate it. I have to say, if monoculturalism exists in your newsroom or your news organizations, I can guarantee so does discrimination. Monoculturalism means that the word itself says it all. Monoculturalism, there is no other room for other cultures. I do not know a single newsroom or news organisation in Aotearoa, New Zealand, or anywhere in the country, in the world, that that if they have monocultural newsrooms and organisations, it means they're not actually representing the multicultural communities in their country. And when we refer to multicultural communities, so it's that multi-lens, it's a mono-lens view of the world and a multi-lens view of the world. And if you're monocultural and you have a mono-lens in your news organisation, individually, systemically, and as an organisation, as part of the industry, you are leaving out all those cultural communities, including Indigenous peoples, your different migrants of colour, generally migrants of colour, depending on where you are in the world, our disabled people, our rainbow community, and all those communities that are marginalised generally by society. So that to me is monoculturalism. It doesn't serve journalism, and it doesn't serve or set us up for the future.
No, and I think it sort of it feeds back into some of our own research at Reuters, both around gender and diversity, and how sorely lacking that still is in newsrooms. But shall we get right into it with your seminar and presentation, and then we'll have more questions after?
Right, kapai. I'm hoping you can see the presentation.
Absolutely.
Ka pai. Mana taurite. Karikia mai tātou. Manawa mai te mauri nuku. Manawa mai te mauri rangi. Ko te mauri kaia. He mauri tipua. Ka pakaru mai te pō. Haumi e hui e. Tai ki e. Ke aku nui, ke aku rahi, e te ti, e te tā, tēnā tātou katoa. Ka nui aku mihi ki ngā mana whenua ki te ao. He mihi maioha ki te Reuters Institute. Kia ora e ho mā. Nau mai, haere mai, ki te mana taurite, from Eurocentric to equitable newsrooms. He mihi maioha ki a koutou, he tohu o te wā. It is the time of whittle. So in te ao Māori, and from my Māori worldview, today, tonight, it's midnight, and it is the time of whittle, which is the new moon. And that is the time of endings and new beginnings. So even though whittle can sometimes be quite a difficult time and period of time for Māori, it is also a time of new beginnings and endings. So I do think it is a good tohu. Kia katia o karu, kia pai ai te kite. Close your eyes so you can see. I'm asking you to close your eyes and open your hearts and minds to hear my kōrero today. Before we go, I just wanted to share one waiata, which means a lot because I just also wanted to set the tone. Aneira taku aroha, aneira taku ngā kau, piri mai tata mai ki au, awhia whitia, aneira, awhia whitia, aneira. So that's my mihi and greetings to you all, a karakia and a waiata to set the tone at this time of whittle. So why? Why are we even talking about this? We all know that the news industry is in a crisis, not just in Aotearoa, New Zealand, but across the world. We all know that we need to improve our audiences and revenue to strengthen and sustain news businesses against a range of challenges, from avoidance to trust erosion, mis and disinformation, accelerating technology and Gen AI, mega social media platforms, declining ads market, political undermining, etc., etc. And so why I wanted to present an Indigenous perspective. An Indigenous perspective on behalf of marginalised communities as well, is what if one solution, not the only solution, but what if one solution was simply newsrooms, news organisations, simply changing your perspective and culture of the organisation. An Indigenous perspective. Why Indigenous? Well, obviously, we're the first people, the first storytellers. Our culture and language was created by the land. I just want to reiterate that point because in New Zealand, Aotearoa, New Zealand, we do have people who refuse to see Māori as Indigenous. But indigeneity or Indigenous peoples are defined by themselves. And there's this whole definitions of what is Indigenous. But Indigenous, our culture and language was created by the land. So we are the people of the land because when we came to Aotearoa from the Pacific, we changed our culture, our traditions, our practices, and our language to suit the land, the water, the ocean, and everything that existed in Aotearoa. And that's why Māori are Indigenous and Māori are unique. And that's why all Indigenous peoples across the country, across the world, are who they are. And as the land remains, so will we. Toitu te whenua, toitu te tangata. Indigenous solutions or models are not the same as using diversity, inclusion, affirmative action, or a voice referendum. Those terms centre Eurocentric or monocultural perspectives on what they think Indigenous and marginalised communities need. Here I'll just pause and say, Indigenous and marginalised communities know what they need. It is up to the organisations to go and talk to them and find out what they need. So we're in a climate crisis, accelerating AI technology, increasing political, social and cultural unrest. The world needs different thinking and actions to restore balance. Mana taurite, mana taurite. The media reflects and research shows us also influences society. We need to restore balance in the media. So mana taurite is restoring balance or equity, if you need an English term. Share power and resources, improve media representation. So mana taurite, it's a model. I've kept it simple. We used this type of model at Stuff. At Stuff, we called it potiaki. But for the model itself, it is simply restoring balance. It is mana taurite. And so it's a model to help improve representation in your organisation and as your organisation reflects and influences society. There are only 4 steps. Ko wai koe, know who you are, know your history, and how it defines and creates your organisation and you individually. Tū tohu, acknowledge. Taurite, restore. Kotahi, thrive together. Those are the 4 elements. So ko wai koe, know who you are. When I spoke earlier, so I am a Ngāti Kahungunu, he uri ahau o Ngāti Kahungunu, Hine Amaru, Rongo Whakaata, me, those are my ancestors, and that's who I descend from. And it's really important for Māori to know who they are, where they come from. So and that's defined in our mihi and our pepeha, we call it. So whenever we introduce ourselves, we always introduce our ancestors, our connections to land and water first, before we actually tell you what our name is. So I could give you 10 sentences before I even tell you who I am. So from that model, we ask you, who are you? Who are you, news organisations? News media organisations have been around for hundreds of years. You have been a part of society for hundreds of years, influencing and shaping society for hundreds of years. Who are you? What is your history? Do you know? So we all know what we do. We hold powerful to account, we seek truth, we champion free speech without fear or favour, we're objective, fourth estate. Those are the high ideals. But in society, you are the powerful. The media organisations and journalists, you are the powerful. You seek truth. Whose truth? From whose perspective? You champion free speech. From what perspective? Whose free speech? Your free speech? When Māori, Indigenous people, or people from marginalised communities stand up, do you champion their free speech? Without fear or favour and objective. Again, from what worldview? The fourth estate. The fourth estate is Eurocentric, colonial, and monocultural. Let's check out the Eurocentric lens. So our Eurocentric lens, which is just a worldview. It's not personal, and it is not based on individuals. It is just a worldview and ideology that comes from Western Europe. And often when we talk about Eurocentrism, I do find that people can get uncomfortable and uneasy around it. And I just like to remind them that as journalists, we like to be objective, so please stay objective. So the Eurocentric lens is the worldview dominating global media, including news. Why is that? Well, news started in Europe, Western Europe, hundreds of years ago, and from there it has developed. But what it means is that the traditions of news across the world, even in non-European countries and non-colonized countries, in newsrooms, we continue to use Western principles to define our news. So in Eurocentric characteristics, the dominant European group holds power and authority in newsrooms, news organizations. If you look around at who owns news organizations, I'm not trying to say they all look the same, but they definitely come from the same socioeconomic group. They very much look very similar, and they generally are not female or any other gender. In media, it's their lens and practices dominating people, culture, and content. When you have a Eurocentric lens, and that is the only lens that is applied to content, people, and the organization itself, discrimination is present. And when I talk about discrimination, I'm not just talking about racism. Discrimination is good because it's the term that covers racism, sexism, homophobia, and all the different isms and phobias that we use and to marginalized communities. Also, Eurocentric is the adversarial lens. That adversarial, and it's not just gotcha, it's adversarial judgment, thus them and us, that adversarial principle or that is part of newsrooms is very difficult for Indigenous and marginalised people to deal with, because that adversarial nature is also a part of our justice system. And our justice system, we know, is very unfair to Indigenous peoples, not only in New Zealand, but across the world. That adversarial justice system, education system, it pervades all systems. So in our Eurocentric lens, so we have a Eurocentric lens in our newsrooms. That's the tradition of news. So you need to know that. If you don't know this history about yourself, why do you think there's a lack of trust and hate that comes from Indigenous and minoritized communities and marginalized communities in your country towards the media? There's a lack of distrust because of the way they've been because of that Eurocentric lens. Colonialism. Oh my God, no one wants to talk about colonialism. Very few people want to acknowledge colonialism. And very few people want to acknowledge that colonialism actually exists within newsrooms and organizations in Aotearoa and around the world. It's the unmentionable C word. It's not the other C word that's the unmentionable, it's colonialism. Because we see colonialism as belonging in the past. What we don't realize is that all the systems and practices that are currently being used in every country set up through European colonialism carries Eurocentric principles. And because of that, and that still exists today, people like to put colonialism in the past. It is not in the past. It is still current and around us. It's in our justice systems. It's everywhere. And just because so we've got Eurocentric and we've got colonialism, but those two things, it doesn't mean that a newsroom in Britain cannot also think about its history and also think about colonialism and how journalism was used during it was a colonization tool. Journalism and the media and newspapers were colonization tools used by European settlers around in the countries to help get settlers and migrants into the country, to set up land transactions, to, yes, hold the government and in developing authority and power in those countries, European authority. But as soon as Māori tried to push back or claims, then the media would, instead of holding the ground of objectivity and putting their view across, and some would and some, but most wouldn't, and they would often side with the process of colonization. And that's really important that newsrooms understand that tradition of their newsrooms. So monocultural news, Eurocentric news, Eurocentric lens, a colonialism lens, or a colonial practices that still exist in newsrooms, and monocultural lens. So often people want to feel, oh, we've progressed a lot, Carmen. We no longer talk about Eurocentrism because we've moved on. We're 5 generations away from our British ancestors, and we're monocultural. We're not Eurocentric. We're very New Zealand in our perspective. Well, actually, what we are is monocultural, because we're still carrying that Eurocentrism through that monocultural lens. And so there is a reluctance to accept the term Eurocentric, preferring monocultural, even though that is a bad term. It's not a bad term, it's just a term. But just remain objective to all these things. And it's just a term. So not all news organizations are Eurocentric, but are monocultural. Monocultural is problematic and shares similar characteristics as Eurocentrism, which is the dominant group holds power and authority. It's their lens and practices dominating people, culture, and content, as well as newsrooms, news organizations. Discrimination is present, and it does not include the worldviews of all people in the country. Say, for example, in Africa. So people go, well, it's not Eurocentric. Yep, but in some newsrooms, we know it is monocultural, and the people holding power and control in the country also hold power and control in their newsrooms, which is the same as in Russia, which is the same as in China. So they continue. It's that monocultural newsroom that is challenging. It doesn't allow for other perspectives. It actually marginalizes people, because you are putting this lens on, and it means everybody outside that lens, their context, there is no context for why things are happening to them, and there is no understanding, and basically you've put them on the outer. So the other thing I've learned is that I've seen is, even in New Zealand and Māori media newsrooms, we haven't fully developed our own communications. We haven't fully developed. So what I mean by that is that non-Western newsrooms will apply Western European and American news standards to validate their news instead of using their own traditional communication practices. So you see some of it, but it's not purposeful. And so I'd really love for more of our Indigenous and marginalised communities to develop their own products and news products, and develop their own ways of telling stories and doing news that takes the best of Eurocentric monocultural news and applies it and uses it and puts an Indigenous lens over it as well. So let's see. So that's the first step. So step 1 is simply knowing who you are, knowing your history, because if you don't know who you are, you won't know where you're going in the future. So tūtohu is the acknowledgement. And tūtohu is really important as well. So first, you must know who you are. You've fully realized all you've done with your how you've reported the news, and then you acknowledge your position. You acknowledge what you've done, and it doesn't have to be a full apology, like some news organizations have done around the world. Very few, I have to say. There are thousands of news outlets around the world, and only a handful, and only very few national news organizations have actually apologized for their representation of a group of people. So Te Puna Stuff Group, so they are the case study. And I did work there, and I loved working there, and they gave me lots of opportunities, from journalism opportunities through to leadership opportunities. So Putiaki was created by a group of 15 senior to junior journalists who came together collectively to ask the owner the first New Zealand owner, which was Sinead Belcher, who bought the company in 2020, to ask her if we could together find ways to improve representation of Māori people, because we had had enough. We, especially the seniors, we had seen what we'd done, how we'd represented Māori Indigenous peoples, and we asked if we could change it, and she was very open to change. So we created this mana taurite, this model. In Te Puna stuff, the model is called Putiaki, so it has its own name, and that's what I would encourage if you were to think about changing the culture of your organization, is using those four steps, but use the names of your own country and of your own people. Use the names of the Indigenous peoples of your land. If you believe you don't have any, which I would argue you do, then find ways that expresses this model in your own language and using your own concepts as well. But because I'm Māori, I'm Indigenous, these are the concepts I use. So we started Putiaki. One of the key things to do for this model is to teach everyone, not just a few leaders here and there, everyone to be their own Putiaki. So everyone needs to understand their history and to work to improve representation of Indigenous marginalised communities. Every single person, from the receptionist to the goddamn CEO to the board member and the owner, they all need to do this. Because if you rely on one or two people, and if you rely on the people of colour or the Indigenous one or two people in your newsrooms, you will fail to change, and you will fail your own people as well as those communities. So, equitable and fair representation, what they did was more use of Te Reo Māori, the Māori language. We had a range of integrated actions, training programs, various measures. Always use data, set your own measures. And those measures are simple things like, okay, we had 120 articles we published today. How many of those were focused on Māori? How many of those Māori ones were positive or negative? How many included female voices? How many included, was there a story, were there stories on our disabled community, our rainbow community? In New Zealand, we have the largest Pacific representation in the world, is here in Aotearoa. The numbers. So love data, very, very helpful to tell the story of your discrimination. Projects, love projects. So one thing we learned is multiple consistent actions over time. It's a long game. We're talking about changing hundreds of years of journalism practices. It's going to take time to change. People get frustrated, people get angry, people say you're not doing enough. But if you do multiple consistent actions over time, one day you'll look up and go, wow, shit, we've changed a lot. So Tā Mātou Pōna was one of those projects we worked on. It took us 2 or 3 months. It took us 3 months, 20 of us. We went in, did a full-scale look at everything from business, sports, different papers across the country, like different regions across the country, the website. We looked at every part of the news business, and what did we find? Unsurprisingly, we found a Eurocentric monocultural news lens, colonialism, existed industry. So it exists in the industry newsroom structure and in our individual journalists as well, because we were overrepresented in Pākehā, which are white New Zealanders, compared to the working group, age group, and underrepresented in Māori and all other marginalised communities. Most of our people also came from middle class backgrounds, and we created negative social stigma and stereotypes against Māori. One of the stories we did was around child abuse. So one of our very clever reporters, Charlie Mitchell, he investigated how we had created, and he found that over time, not just Stuff, but other news organisations in Aotearoa had also created racism, stigma, and negative stereotypes about Māori and child abuse. New Zealand's child abuse problem, they flipped it and it became a Māori problem. So abuse involving Māori children and adults were amplified. Abuse against non-Māori children and adults were muted. When I saw this story, I got very upset. I was upset for our non-Māori children because they deserved their stories to be amplified as much as our Māori kids, their stories were amplified. I was very angry at how we had muted the abusers, non-Māori abusers. And so it was a very disturbing investigation and publication, and it really struck home with our readers. Also, we're talking about editorial coverage, like editors of newspapers, news leaders. They were writing articles and writing opinion pieces about Māori being the problem, that Māori leaders and Māori communities needed to sort out this child abuse problem, not realizing that they had created this misinformation. And this is one of the problems with Eurocentrism and monocultural newsrooms and colonial newsrooms, is that you can create misinformation because you're using just that one lens. And non-Māori abuse was an individual problem, not a society problem. Terrible. Terrible, our children. So taurite, which is to restore. That photo there was another project we did, which was Te Mataro, which is an online animated training program that covers a range of subjects for all staff to do. It's not compulsory, but all staff at staff are encouraged to do it. And part of it was a wānanga, the one and only wānanga we've had, which is a gathering together for a day of news leaders from across every news organisation in Aotearoa to come together and to talk about how we can improve representation. And that's what we did last year. And so let's talk about cultural safety. Cultural safety is critical awareness of role, organisation, culture, power dynamics, and how it impacts others in your organisation externally, and addresses discrimination. So a culturally unsafe newsroom is Eurocentric, monocultural. It has discrimination, systemic, structural, and/or individual, colonialism, power imbalance, fragility, centres the majority, and the microaggressions that I've experienced personally is unreal. Misinformation, ignorance, lack of context, tokenisms. That, if you see those words and you think, that looks familiar, but you can create culturally safe newsrooms. It's using this multi-lens approach. It's using a model like mana taurite. The big one is relationships. Build your relationships with your Indigenous peoples and your marginalised communities. Every country in the world has marginalised communities. You know who they all are. Build relationships with them, because you build relationships, you will improve audiences, you will improve trust, improve audiences, and create business and partnership opportunities. The beauty about this, the beauty about a culturally safe newsroom is the innovation that can come. It's the things that we don't know because we've not done them. And when you start to do these, you can start to open up to all sorts of concepts. So at Stuff, we moved all of our news publications have bilingual titles. The organisation itself has bilingual titles. We changed one of the newspapers. It used to be called the Dominion Post. Dominion no longer served its purposes. It is now just called the Post. The Post te Ika Maui. So there's little things that you can do that are actually quite magical. And they may not seem like a big deal to some people, but to others, it actually makes a big deal. So multi-lens approach, a culturally safe newsroom is using a multi-lens approach, relationships, community and organizational partnerships, projects, pathways, multiple perspectives, improve your perspectives, voices, experiences, improve your audiences, business opportunities. Last year, another thing we did is that we partnered with our big Sky media in New Zealand, Aotearoa New Zealand, and we took their Te Reo Māori coverage of the Rugby World Cup, and we played that live on our digital platform, and we got thousands of views. It was fantastic. And so those little things, that may just seem like a little thing, but it means a lot. And so, and it means you can be creative and innovative. So a culturally safe newsroom has anti-discrimination practices. It's easier for you to see discrimination and deal with it quickly if you know about it and you know what it looks like. So you need to teach everyone and train everyone up about what it looks like, what a discriminatory news headline looks like, or remarks made during a broadcast. And so awareness of monoculture and shared power, because Eurocentric, colonial, and monocultural, it's all about power. Someone has all the power, and it's usually not Indigenous and marginalised people. It means instead of the fragility, you actually have objectivity, because you decenter yourself out of this trying to improve representation and remind yourself, actually, it's not about me. It is the past. We know what we've done. We know that part of ourselves. Let's just carry on and fix it, and let's try to do better over time. So misinformation, ignorance, lack of context, understanding context. So if we had a story about politicians who are punching down, by the way, because they were punching down, calling out students Māori and Pacifica students who had their own cultural spaces at a university. They said, these politicians waited and says, why is that so? We are one people. We should not have these spaces. We reported on that, but there was no context to explain why Māori and Pacifica students needed those safe spaces. Obviously, they needed those safe spaces because they were in a Eurocentric, colonial, monocultural university. So they needed those spaces, cultural spaces, to help them feel safe. It's as simple as that. And universities are doing really well at trying to fix all these. They know this because universities are really good at talking about decolonisation. And so they push back against the politicians on behalf of the students. And I'm glad they did, because always these things are about power. Who has the power, who doesn't? Who can use their power for good? So intention, consistent, multiple actions over time is what we need. So I just want to say there's a lot of good stuff happening. And we actually have moved very far across. We're moving, we're improving. And I just want to say it's okay if people accuse you of being woke. Wear it with pride. People would call stuff woke, and it would upset some people at stuff, some of the leaders, and I would say, why? It's okay to be woke. But the problem that news organizations and businesses have is that when they are accused of woke, they feel like they're going to lose business because the unwoke people of the society have all the money and power too. So wider awareness of discrimination, we know this, we're starting to know what that looks like in newsrooms. More attention paid to newsroom bias, we know this. Increasing representation of Indigenous marginalised people, that is happening, but it's not happening enough. You look around your newsrooms, you look around your J schools, who is in those positions of leadership? And of course, how are we representing people in content? Use data, set up your measures, set your measures and outcomes, and then just report on it monthly, and just let your organization or institution know how you're doing and reporting. Obviously more work to do, but we have moved. And can I say, this is how we know we've moved. When Google has to apologize for not showing achievements of white people. And finally, kotahi, thrive together. When you know your history, you've acknowledged it, and you've created your own morals and ways of being in your organization, then you come to kotahi, which is to thrive together. So at Stuff, we campaigned for New Zealand to have its own Indigenous public holiday, which is called Matariki, and it happened. It was a successful campaign, and Matariki will forever be part of our public holidays every year. So those are all the amazing things you can do if you just improve your representation. Nā reira, tēnā tātou katoa.
That was fascinating. And I think for anyone in any sort of culture community, Carmen, there are so many examples that pop up quite immediately while thinking about what our own cultural context looks like and what those who are often ignored or not included in those contexts feel. What I'm going to do in the interest of time is first dive right into the questions, and then if there's time, I'll pose mine as well to you. So let me first head to our room where our journalist fellows are waiting, and there's a couple of questions lined up. Let's go in the order that they were asked. So perhaps we could start with Rebecca, if we could switch the cameras on and the mics on. And just as a note to our journalist fellows, do sort of introduce yourself and where you're from before you pose your question. Rebecca, you're up first.
Tēnā hui, Carmen. Ngā mihi nui mō tō kōrero I tēnei rā, I tēnei pō, ko
Kia ora, Rebecca.
no Tamaki Makaurau aho. I'm here at the Roses Institute. I would really love to hear about whether you have any insights on how to carry these initiatives forward over time when it's a period of upheaval in journalism. You have management changing, you have belts tightening, you have lots of journalists being let go. I know that the Pōtiaki team at Stuff is much smaller than it was even in 2022, and it's not publishing as regularly. And I'm just wondering how, if you have observed that, if you have any thoughts based on that experience about how to carry through these initiatives about interrogating the news that's being published and maintaining cultural safety, even when things are becoming a little bit.
Yeah. So everyone goes back to their default position, which is really disappointing because the default position got us here into the first place. So if we're in a time of crisis, everything that we've done to get to that point is obviously not working. Therefore, how about you change the model and think a little bit more cleverly and strategically about all the things that you've done in the past that haven't worked. So it's not just about the revenue models as well. So businesses need audiences, and they need loyal audiences that are going to turn up, pay, watch ads, and subscribe, right? So they need those audiences. If you think strategically, you can develop and build audiences with those marginalized communities that no longer trust you. So it's finding those, using trust measures and strategies to bring those communities into your organization. Because one thing we did notice was that the Māori audience didn't change. It stayed what happened where other audiences were up and down all over the place. It's from the time of the apology and the work that we started doing with Pōtiaki was it stayed the same. And that's really important because it means they didn't leave where everybody else is leaving the news. And Māori in particular, because Māori really don't like the media. Even my own relations have told me to F off now and again. It's quite sad. sad, but it just means that there's a lot of work to do. But it is doable. You actually just have to commit to it and do it. And although we're losing news, we're moving into this new phase of news organizations. We're moving into news ecosystems. Ecosystems means that you need all parts going. So in ecosystems, there is a lot of variation. And so if you were clever and you were a news organization, you would start to build partnerships and relationships with communities who can serve and create their own media content or news content. Why not help them to create their own product that then you attach to your platform? You get their audience, you get their advertising, shared, of course, shared. But those are things that you can think about, right? So traditional news, and you know who I'm talking about when I say people who bang on about legacy news media organizations, because that's their way of undermining legacy news organizations, right? They use that to undermine them. But at the same time, we can say, oh, well, yes, we can use these platforms they've already got established audiences. So why not start to create new products and create products that are representative of all our different communities? Build relationships, build partnerships, build products that represent these communities.
Next question all teed up. I think it's Osama. Osama, go ahead. You're on mute.
Am I okay now?
Yes, you are.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for this presentation. My name is Osama Bulki. I come from Kurdistan region. I'm Kurdish. I mean, it's very interesting to hear from you from there, but I also come from Kurdistan, where part of it is in Turkey, and almost every city has got two names. And for us, it is very inclusive when people are using the Kurdish name for the cities, because it is Kurdish originally. So like Diyarbakir is called Ahmed. And so it just, part of that is also about the name and being inclusive of, like, you know, what the people themselves refer to the place. But my question is on, you said, like, you know, the newsrooms are using Western-based measures to validate news. And then you said the solution is to use traditional communication practices. I'd like to hear more, like, what do you mean by that? Like, what is it that different from the already established measures in the newsrooms?
Yeah. So that adversarial type of news, gone. It wouldn't exist, right? So that's the gotcha news. We saw a very bad example of gotcha journalism in Australia the other week on Sky News, when a young man won $1 million in a fishing competition and went on Sky News, and all he could say to him was, oh, you've got a criminal record. Are you going to pay with that money you've got? Are you going to pay it back? What bullshit is that? So that adversary, so what he did was he forgot his power, and he forgot that he was punching down to this young man who's, I think he may have only been 20. So understanding power is a really good thing for news organizations, individuals, because people forget how powerful news organizations are. Yes, times are desperate, and yes, things are crumbling and failing all over the place, but there's still power in media. Because if you look at media depictions, movies, music, poetry, all publications, all of that, who is seen the most? Who are the faces we see the most in Western societies and societies colonized by Western European countries? We know who they are. So for traditional news organizations, for Māori, we would use kōrero, which is, or whai kōrero. We would use our concepts like mana taurite, which is restoring balance, ensuring when we do upset things, we can use things like mana taurite to fix it. So it's using our own concepts to actually communicate and tell stories. We don't need to have the same types of news traditions in Māori newsrooms or in different newsrooms because they just haven't served us. So, and we also got our own ways of telling stories. The problem, part of the problem is that we've been told we're shit for so long, Māori people have, is that we actually have lost trust in our own communication tools and our own ways of doing things. And the same as with people from marginalised communities, is that the dominant culture has always told us we're crap, and therefore we don't trust and back our own stuff. And so we use news journalism practices, Western European news practices, traditionally colonial, because we think that's the only way we will get any proper recognition of our news stories, that it's the only way to do journalism. It's not the only way to do journalism. Journalism is storytelling with facts and figures, holding the powerful to account, all these things, but doing it your way in your own language, not just in your own language, using your own concepts that are different from Western European concepts.
Let me pick up a question that's come online and sort of merge it with my own, Carmen, which is around hiring practices and some of the very preliminary research around sort of the issue of minority ethnic recruitment. Is editors coming back and saying, well, we didn't get enough applications from minority candidates. Universities and colleges aren't doing enough. And often this question of, building and fostering diversity seems to become a hiring call and an HR problem rather than, a newsroom challenge. How do we unbundle that? And how do we make more conscious editorial policy changes and hiring changes?
I hate that excuse. I have heard that so often, it actually drives me nuts, because our hiring practices, we use the same hiring practices for the same people, for different people. Does that make sense? So we just have our hiring practice and expect that it'll attract people from marginalised communities. Duh, it's not. Change it, use languages, go to the places where these people are, build the pathways. You've got to build pathways. You actually have to get into high schools. You actually have to get into universities and build pathways with high schools and J schools, because it's the only way to do it. The other thing too is that we've got to stop thinking that people have got to come from J schools. The best journalists I've known, they either started in the newsroom as cadets, or the guy that did the story about Māori being the face of child abuse in New Zealand started off his life as a geologist. So that's what I mean. Journalists can come from anywhere, but we just stick to our tried and true and think, oh well, it worked for our Pākehā colleagues who came in, therefore it's going to work for everyone. And this is the problem with monoculturalism, is that we monoculturalize every aspect of journalism, every single aspect, including the hiring, because what I mean by that is that we expect everyone to be the same, do the same, think the same, because we don't see skin color, we don't see race, we don't see difference, that sort of thinking, which is bullshit. So it's just an excuse. It's actually lazy. And this is what I mean. So this whole change your culture, improve representation, you got to think, you actually have to change your mindset and think differently, which is why we say you've got your Eurocentric lens, or if you're not Eurocentric, you've got your monocultural lens. Understand there's colonial traits there as well. That's your lens. Move it over, put this other lens on. Okay, we want to bring Māori people in. How do we do it? Oh, I know. Go and talk to Māori. Oh, we want to bring young people in from poor communities. Oh, really? I got a good idea. Go and talk to those communities. Talk to the communities, get their ideas, and use their ideas to bring people in.
Just enough time for one final question then. From your experience of what you saw and built at Stuff, how do you build accountability and sustainability on what you're doing in terms of being more inclusive or building that and fostering that, particularly in an environment? Can't have a seminar without saying the word AI, particularly in an environment where AI is perpetuating a lot of those biases.
I'm not going to blame AI for biases because those biases have been around hundreds of years. AI only just turned up. So it's actually really hard because it's all parts of the business have to accept the change. So, you know, when you're trying to change a human, it's actually really hard. Unless they want to change themselves, they're not going to change. So what we do is that's why it's important to turn everyone into the Potiaki. So everyone is the Potiaki, and actually everyone is expected to improve representation, not just the journalist. Because too often we just put it on the individual journalists, when in fact everyone needs to shift their thinking, and they just need to be taught to put on different lenses. When you apply all these different lenses to your worldview, you start to see the world differently, and you can start to come up with way better and more innovative ideas, and you create sustainability. So you have to get the structure, you have to create a structure and put it into the organisation. Too often, and this is the problem with Potiaki, is that in New Zealand, everyone thought Potiaki was just the journalists and a section on Stuff. It was not. Potiaki was the whole culture. It was a culture at Stuff of trying to improve representation and knowing that they had to improve representation. So there were journalists who had Potiaki titles, but every single journalist was expected to be a Potiaki journalist. Every single one of them, not just the one that had the title Potiaki. So they were there for leadership opportunities, and because we were trying to create pathways. That's what those journalists were there for. And I get really hoha when hoha means, I don't even know what English word is, when people say, oh, you lost all your Potiaki journalists. No, we didn't lose all our Potiaki journalists, because every single journalist at Stuff is supposed to be their own Potiaki. And that's the difference, is that every single individual at the organisation has to know and understand what it is, what this cultural shift is, and how they can do it. The other thing is, structurally, it needs to be in the structure, so that when people come and go, that kaupapa or that purpose will remain with that organisation forever, so that it becomes part of the DNA of the company.
If you don't know who you are, you won't know where you're going. I think I'm going to sort of print that out and hold it up for myself. Carmen, it's been such a pleasure having you. And amongst other firsts, we have also time traveled, where you are now on Thursday and we are still in Wednesday. So in many ways, you're sort of leading the way and we're following you. Thank you very much.
That's right. That's right.
Thank you very much from all of us at the Institute. And I hope everyone else has enjoyed listening to this as well. So much to take back and think about. Thank you, Carmen.
Hapai koutou, he mihi aroha kia koutou. Ho maari e.
That's it for this session, folks. We'll see you, of course, again on Wednesday. I hope you enjoyed this, and we're looking forward to catching up with you again on our next Global Journalism